The autumn afternoon was picture-perfect in Henderson, Kentucky. Golden sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of the Henderson family home, casting delicate shadows across the living room floor. Outside, children played in the distance, their laughter carried on the crisp fall breeze. Inside the modest two-story house on Maple Street, 9-year-old Maya Henderson sat cross-legged on the worn Persian rug, her pigtails tied with faded pink ribbons. She was drawing, something she loved to do, her colored pencils spread across a sketch pad like a precious treasure. She was drawing her cat, Whiskers, who lounged lazily on the window seat, soaking in the afternoon warmth. Maya had always been the kind of child who filled silences with words. Her third-grade teacher often joked that Maya could talk to a brick wall and convince it to tell her a story in return. She was the girl who narrated her entire day to anyone who would listen. What she ate for breakfast, what happened at school, what her friends said, what she dreamed about at night. Her voice was like a constant melody in the Henderson household, singing while she brushed her teeth, humming while she did her homework, chattering endlessly at dinner. Her mother adored this about her. Her father sometimes told her to pipe down a bit, but even he smiled when she wasn't looking. That day, September 15th, started like any other Tuesday. Maya came home from school excited about a math test she'd aced. She burst through the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, already launching into a detailed account of everything that had happened. Her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and she listened with that special attention mothers give to their children, asking questions and marveling at each small triumph. Maya's father had left his job as a construction foreman early that day, something about a scheduling conflict. He was in his study, drinking beer and watching the news, his mood darker than usual. By late afternoon, tension had crept into the house like fog rolling in from the valley. Maya noticed it the way children always do, in the subtle shifts of adult behavior, the clipped way her parents spoke to each other, the absence of the usual dinner table conversation. Her mother moved quietly through the kitchen, her smile dimmed. Her father had consumed 3 beers and was becoming increasingly agitated about something related to work, money, or both. Maya couldn't quite piece it together from the fragments she overheard. Around 5:30, everything changed. It started with harsh words exchanged in the kitchen. Maya sat in the living room, trying to focus on her drawing, but her ears instinctively tuned into the rising volume of her parents' voices. Her mother was defending something, her father was accusing. The usual pattern, but with sharper edges today. Maya had learned to tune these moments out, to retreat into her drawings, to make herself small and quiet. Children develop these survival skills without anyone teaching them. Then came a sound that made her pencil freeze mid-stroke. "You're a liar," her father roared. "You think I don't know where you've been." "You're being paranoid," her mother replied, her voice tight with fear. "I told you, I was at the grocery store, then I picked up Maya's prescription from the pharmacy." "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. Maya's heart began to race. She'd heard arguments before. What child of divorce? Something felt different about this one. The energy was darker, more dangerous. She set down her colored pencil carefully and stood up, unsure what to do. Should she go to her room? Should she stay? Every instinct screamed at her to hide, but she was frozen, a small animal caught in oncoming headlights. Her mother emerged from the kitchen first, her face flushed. "Maya, honey, why don't you go upstairs to your room for a bit?" But her father appeared right behind her, his face twisted with rage, his large frame filling the doorway. Henderson was a big man, 6'2", muscular from years of construction work. When he was angry, he seemed to take up all the air in the room. "I'm not done talking to you," he said too, his voice a dangerous whisper. "Please, Maya's here," her mother said, her eyes pleading. But he wasn't listening. He grabbed her mother's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. Maya watched as her mother winced in pain. Something inside the 9-year-old wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to call for help. But her body wouldn't obey. She stood transfixed, watching the scene unfold as if she were watching a movie rather than living through it. "Please," her mother whispered, her eyes darting toward Maya, "not in front of her." For a moment, just a moment, his eyes flickered with something almost like recognition, almost like he might stop, but then his jaw clenched and his hand balled into a fist. "You've humiliated me for the last time," he said. And then he swung. It happened so fast. One moment her father's fist was at his side, and the next moment it was connecting with her mother's face with a sickening crack, like someone dropping a melon on concrete. Her mother's head snapped backward, and a spray of blood painted the white kitchen doorframe like a grotesque abstract painting. Crumpled to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. She fell hard, her temple connecting with the corner of the coffee table. Blood pooled beneath her head, spreading across the Persian rug where Maya had been drawing just minutes before. That's when Maya's mouth opened. She opened it to scream. She absolutely intended to scream. She could feel the scream rising up from somewhere deep in her chest, building like a pressure that needed release. She could see the scream forming in her mind, a long, desperate wail that would shatter the windows and summon help. Her facial muscles contorted, her throat tightened, and her lungs filled with air. But no sound came out. Nothing, complete silence. It was as if her body had decided, in that fraction of a second, that screaming was too dangerous. That sound was a weapon her father might use against her. That silence was survival. Her body locked down every part of her that could produce noise, as if her very survival depended on becoming invisible, inaudible, incorporeal. Her father, shocked by his own violence, stood staring at his unconscious wife. For a moment, he seemed to come back to himself, as if waking from a nightmare. He looked at Maya, seeing her for the first time since the rage had taken hold. His expression shifted, shock, regret, panic, all warring across his features. "Maya," he started, taking a step toward her. "I didn't," she was. But Maya was already backing away, her mouth still open in that silent scream, her eyes wide and unblinking. She backed toward the stairs, one step at a time, never taking her eyes off her father, never making a sound. Her mother was rushed to the hospital with a concussion and a broken cheekbone. The police came. Statements were taken. Social services became involved, and Maya never spoke again. Not that night, not the next morning, not in the weeks and months that followed. The doctors said it was selective mutism, a psychological response to trauma. They said she'd speak again when she felt safe. They said it was temporary, treatable, that with therapy and time, her voice would return. They didn't know what Maya knew, that her silence had saved her life. That sound was dangerous. That words were weapons. And so she learned to live in the quiet. She became a ghost in her own existence, present but unreachable, visible but unseen. Her voice, which had once filled every room with light and laughter, simply ceased to exist. And no one, despite their best intentions and professional expertise, knew how to bring it back. Not yet, anyway. Henderson had watched her granddaughter disappear over the course of 18 months. It was like watching someone fade slowly, as if Maya was becoming less solid, less real with each passing day. The vibrant, chattering girl who once filled every space with joy and noise had become a whisper, or rather, worse than a whisper, because a whisper still implied sound. Maya had become pure silence. Maya's paternal grandmother was 73 years old and had buried 2 husbands and a son. She was not a woman easily broken by life's cruelties, but watching her granddaughter retreat into herself, watching the light dim in those young eyes day after day, broke something inside her that she didn't know could break. She tried everything. Child psychologists, 3 of them, 2 different medications, art therapy, music therapy, even a specialist in selective mutism who drove in from Louisville once a month. Nothing worked. The doctors all said the same thing: she'll speak when she feels safe. Healing takes time. We need patience. But was running out of patience. More importantly, she was running out of time. At 73, she couldn't shake the feeling that if they didn't reach Maya soon, the girl would disappear entirely, not physically, but in every way that mattered. She'd become a living ghost. It was best friend, who mentioned the sanctuary, had been volunteering at a local animal rescue, and had heard through the grapevine about an extraordinary woman who ran a rehabilitation center for traumatized animals on the outskirts of Louisville. "They call her the Animal Whisperer," said one afternoon over tea. "She works with abused dogs and somehow matches them with people who need healing. It's not therapy exactly, it's something different, something more." "It's called nonsense," said, but even as she said it, something stirred inside her. "Maybe," replied, "but I've seen photographs. The transformations are remarkable, and she works with kids too, I think. Children who experience trauma." That night did what any determined grandmother would do. She Googled. The website for Sanctuary for Healing appeared on her screen like a beacon. The photographs were extraordinary: dogs with second chances, children with haunted eyes slowly beginning to smile again. And at the center of it all was bio read like something from a novel. Born in San Francisco to immigrant parents, she'd studied veterinary science but had abandoned that path after volunteering at an animal shelter and realizing that the deeper work wasn't medical, it was psychological. For 23 years, she'd been running her sanctuary, rehabilitating abused and traumatized animals, and carefully matching them with people whose lives had been shattered by their own kinds of violence. She held multiple certifications in animal therapy, trauma counseling, and something called communication. But it was her eyes in the photographs that caught attention. Eyes held something recognized, the look of someone who understood that sometimes conventional help wasn't enough, the look of someone who'd seen miracles. Picked up the phone. Answered on the third ring, her voice warm and surprisingly young-sounding. When explained Maya's situation, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I can see her," finally said, "but I need to be honest with you, I don't promise miracles. What I do promise is that we'll introduce her to a companion who truly understands what she's going through. Sometimes that's the first step." "Can we come?" asked, already reaching for her appointment book. "Yes, how about next Saturday?" The drive to the sanctuary took 45 minutes and spent the entire ride talking softly to Maya, who stared out the window at the passing landscape. Told stories about Maya's mother when she was little, about the time they'd gotten lost in the woods and found a hidden waterfall, about anything and everything except what they were about to do. She didn't want Maya to feel pressure or expectation. She simply wanted her granddaughter to feel safe. The sanctuary appeared gradually as they drove deeper into the Kentucky hills. It wasn't what expected. Instead of a sterile facility, it was a sprawling property with open fields, several small cottages, and a main building that looked more like a comfortable home than a clinical treatment center. Wildflowers bloomed in the gardens, and spotted several dogs of various sizes and colors playing in a large, well-maintained field. Was waiting for them on the porch. She was smaller than expected, maybe 5'4", with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul. She wore simple jeans and a cream-colored sweater, and moved with the kind of grace that comes from decades of mindful living. "You must be," said, extending her hand. Then she turned to Maya and her expression softened even further. "And you're Maya, I'm so glad you came." Maya didn't respond, she couldn't, but she did something she rarely did anymore. She made eye contact. For a moment held her breath, watching her granddaughter study this stranger. "Come," said gently, "there's someone I'd like you to meet." They walked through the sanctuary and began explaining how she worked, how she rescued animals that had been abused or neglected, how she rehabilitated them, how she learned their unique personalities and struggles. Some animals, she explained, had experienced such trauma that they mirrored the trauma of certain humans. "When that happens," said, "something remarkable can occur. Two broken beings recognizing each other." They arrived at a smaller enclosure surrounded by a sturdy fence. Inside, a large golden retriever lay in the shade of an oak tree, apparently sleeping, but as they approached, the dog's head lifted. "This is Buddy," said. "He was found 2 years ago chained in a backyard with no food or water for weeks. His owner had beaten him regularly. When we brought him here, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't play, wouldn't trust anyone. He just lay in a corner and waited for the next beating." Felt tears prick her eyes. "But slowly," continued, "Buddy began to heal, and I've been waiting for the right companion for him, someone who might understand what it's like to have violence rob you of your voice." At gesture, they entered the enclosure. Buddy watched them approach with cautious eyes, hung back but gently guided Maya forward. "You don't have to do anything," said softly. "Just be yourself. Let him know you understand." For a long moment, nothing happened. Maya and Buddy simply regarded each other, two traumatized beings seeing themselves reflected in another's gaze. Then, slowly, Maya's trembling right hand extended toward the dog, not in greeting exactly, but in acknowledgement. Buddy rose to his feet and approached. He was a large dog, probably 75 pounds, with a beautiful golden coat marred by scars. He walked straight to Maya and pressed his head against her extended hand. And something shifted. Watched as her granddaughter's shoulders, which had been tense and rigid for 18 months, seemed to soften. Maya's fingers curled gently into Buddy's fur. She didn't smile, not yet, but her breathing changed. It slowed. It deepened. Buddy leaned his entire body against Maya's small frame as if to say, "I see you. I understand. You're safe with me." Watched with knowing eyes. "I think," she said quietly too, "we might have found something here." It was the first ray of hope had felt in nearly 2 years. As she watched her granddaughter stand in silence with an equally broken dog, she realized something profound. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from being fixed. Sometimes it comes from being truly, completely understood. And sometimes, that understanding comes from the most unexpected places. It started on the second visit to the sanctuary, just 5 days after Maya and Buddy had first met. Had driven her granddaughter back, hoping to build on whatever fragile connection had begun to form. Met them at the entrance with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. "He's been waiting," said simply, "Come." This time, when they reached the enclosure, Buddy was already on his feet, his golden body tense with anticipation. The moment he caught sight of Maya, his tail wagged, not frantically, but with a controlled, purposeful motion, as if he was trying to communicate something specific through that movement alone. Maya's small face remained expressionless, but she walked toward him with surprising confidence. And then something extraordinary happened. Instead of simply petting Buddy as she had before, Maya placed her open palm flat against his chest. She held it there for a long moment, as if feeling his heartbeat, checking that it was real. Then, slowly and deliberately, she moved her hand in a small circle over his heart. Stepped closer, her eyes narrowing with fascination. Buddy responded by leaning his entire body weight into Maya, pressing himself against her as if trying to merge with her. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a complete submission of his physical being to her control. Over the following weeks, began to notice something remarkable happening. Each time they visited, Maya and Buddy seemed to communicate through an increasingly sophisticated system of gestures. It was as if they were developing their own language, one that required no words, no sounds, but only intention and understanding. Began documenting everything in a leather journal, making notes and sketches of each gesture and its apparent meaning. She set up a comfortable observation area where could sit while she watched the interactions unfold. "What you're witnessing," explained one afternoon, "is the language of trauma survivors. Both of them were rendered voiceless by violence, Buddy physically, through pain and fear, Maya psychologically, through shock. They're showing each other that communication exists beyond words." One gesture emerged frequently. Maya would tap twice on her chest, right over her heart. When she did this, Buddy would stop whatever he was doing, whether he was playing, exploring, or resting, and immediately approach Maya. Then he would lower his head and rest it directly on that same spot on her chest, his ear positioned as if listening for her heartbeat. "That's trust," whispered Tu. "She's saying I need you, and he's saying I hear you, I'm here." Another gesture developed around 3 fingers pressed together firmly against her collarbone. When Maya made this signal, Buddy would sit perfectly still, his body rigid, his eyes locked on hers. He wouldn't move until she released the pressure and opened her fingers. Theorized that this was Maya's way of saying, "Stay with me, don't leave." But the most heart-wrenching gesture was the one that appeared when Maya was struggling with her emotions. Sometimes, usually around late afternoon when the shadows grew long, Maya would wrap her arms around herself and squeeze. Her face would go pale, her breathing would become shallow, and her eyes would go distant. These were the moments when nightmares were close, when the memory of her father's violence threatened to pull her under. During these episodes, Maya would make a specific gesture, both hands positioned at her temples, fingers splayed as if pressing outward. It was a gesture of pain, of pressure, of a mind overwhelmed. The first time she made this gesture, Buddy seemed to understand instinctively what was needed. He didn't simply approach her. He positioned himself so that his entire body was pressed against her side, supporting her weight. Then he would remain absolutely still, his breathing synchronized with hers, for as long as it took for the moment to pass. "He's grounding her," explained Tu, her voice thick with emotion, reminding her that she's present, that her body is safe, that she's not alone in her own mind. Suggested that they increase Maya's visits to 3 times a week. "They need this," she said simply. "Both of them are healing each other." Over the course of 6 months, the gestural language became increasingly complex. There was a gentle pushing motion of Maya's hands outward that meant "I'm happy, I want to play." There was a very specific touch, thumb pressing gently on Buddy's nose, that apparently meant "You're okay, you're safe." There was a hand placed over her mouth followed by a reaching outward gesture that seemed to signify, "I wish I could tell you things, I wish I could speak." The most significant breakthrough came on a cold January afternoon when snow was falling softly outside the sanctuary. Maya and Buddy were in their usual spot. A small shelter had built under an old oak tree. Watched from a distance as Maya made a gesture she'd never made before. She spread all her fingers wide on one hand and slowly brought them to her heart, then opened them like a flower blooming. Buddy's response was immediate and powerful. He stood and turned in a complete circle, his tail moving in that purposeful way, and then he placed his head directly in Maya's lap. He remained there, absolutely still, for several minutes. When he finally moved, was wiping tears from her face. "Do you know what that meant?" she asked quietly. Shook her head. She was saying, "I love you." And he was acknowledging it, accepting it, understanding that despite all the pain, despite all the silence, love is still possible. As spring began to arrive and the world greened again, taught to recognize and understand the language, there were over 20 distinct gestures now, each with specific meaning. A circular motion across the heart meant, "I love you." 2 sharp taps on the collarbone meant, "I'm scared." A gentle squeeze of Buddy's ear meant, "Thank you." Fingers walking down his spine meant, "Tell me a story." Though how a dog could tell a story was beyond comprehension, yet somehow Buddy seemed to understand. One afternoon, asked a question that had been forming in her mind for months. "Do you think she'll ever speak again?" Was quiet for a long moment, watching as Maya made a complex series of gestures to Buddy, and the dog responded with a series of movements and head tilts that constituted a full conversation. "I think," finally said, "that Maya has already found her voice. It's just not using words. She's speaking volumes. Buddy understands every single thing she says, and more importantly, she understands herself again. That's where healing begins." But notice something else. Gradually, over the course of those 6 months, something was shifting in Maya's eyes. The light was returning. The ghost was becoming more solid, more real. The girl wasn't the same as she had been. She was marked by her trauma, just as Buddy was marked by his. But she was becoming whole again, one silent gesture at a time. And in that silence, realized, there was more communication than there had ever been in all of Maya's words before. Henderson had spent 2 years reconstructing her life from the rubble of that terrible September day. The reconstruction had been painful, deliberate, and inch by agonizing inch. She'd left the hospital with a broken cheekbone that never healed quite straight, resulting in a permanent, slight asymmetry to her face. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the violence. But she decided long ago that she wouldn't let that violence define her future. The first thing had done was secure a protective order against. The second was to find an apartment 20 miles away, in a different county, where she could start fresh. The third was to enroll in a comprehensive domestic violence recovery program. For 2 years, she'd attended therapy twice a week. She joined support groups where other women shared their stories of survival. She'd taken anger management classes, not because she was angry, but because understanding anger, learning to recognize its patterns, seemed crucial to her healing. She'd worked with a career counselor and landed a stable job as an administrative assistant at a local hospital. She'd rebuilt her credit, her confidence, and her sense of self. But she hadn't rebuilt her relationship with her daughter. That had been forbidden. The custody agreement, established by judge after the incident, had awarded temporary custody to pending further evaluation and maternal rehabilitation. The intent, apparently, had been to protect Maya from further trauma while giving time to get her life together. But what it had effectively done was strip of her daughter for 2 years. She was allowed supervised visitation one Saturday afternoon a month. One afternoon, 30 days of a month, and she could see her daughter for 4 hours under the watchful eye of a court-appointed supervisor. During those 4 hours, Maya would sit silently beside her, no longer the chattering, singing daughter she'd known, but a quiet ghost of a girl. They would color together or watch movies or play games, but the connection felt distant, like trying to touch someone through thick glass. After each visit, would drive to her apartment and cry until there were no more tears left. But she never gave up. She documented everything, her therapy sessions, her job stability, her completed courses. She wrote journal entries about her growth, her remorse, her desperate love for her daughter. She attended every court-ordered appointment and exceeded every requirement placed upon her. Then in early March, something shifted. Received a call from her lawyer, an efficient and compassionate woman named Sarah, no relation to at the sanctuary, though would later think that the universe has a sense of poetry about coincidences. Sarah's voice was cautiously optimistic. "It's been denying Maya access to something she needs," Sarah explained. "A therapeutic animal. There's been a recommendation from a trauma specialist that she continue working with this dog. Has been refusing, claiming it's an unnecessary expense and that the dog is interfering with family bonding." Felt something shift in her chest. A dog. Maya had found something to hold onto. "This works in our favor," Sarah continued. "The refusal to support recommended therapeutic treatment is a violation of the custody order. It gives us grounds to petition for modification. I'm filing for a custody review hearing." The next 6 weeks were a blur of legal documents, psychological evaluations, and carefully constructed arguments. Both parents had to undergo updated assessments. Both had to provide evidence of their current living situations and their ability to support Maya's therapeutic needs. Fought back hard. He hired an expensive lawyer and argued that was unstable, that she'd abandoned her family, that Maya was finally adjusting and bonding with him after 2 years. He claimed the dog was a distraction from proper parenting, and that Maya's silence proved she was still traumatized and needed consistency, not changes. Became crucial to his case. As Maya's grandmother and the person facilitating the dog therapy, she provided testimony about Maya's dramatic improvement. She brought photographs showing Maya's increased engagement with life, sketches she'd drawn, small smiles caught on camera, moments of connection with Buddy. But the most powerful testimony came from appeared at the preliminary hearing wearing a simple dress and carrying a meticulously documented case file. She for over an hour about selective mutism, trauma response, and the scientifically proven benefits of animal-assisted therapy. She showed the court her certifications, her credentials, her years of success stories. She explained, in terms a judge could understand, that Maya's bond with Buddy represented genuine psychological progress, not regression. The child's silence is not a sign of ongoing trauma. It's a sign of processing. She's learning to communicate again, just not through spoken words. That's actually a healthy adaptation. Forcing her to abandon this therapeutic relationship would be harmful to her recovery. The lawyer attempted to discredit her, suggesting that had a financial interest in the case since she ran a sanctuary that charged fees, but calmly explained that she worked on a sliding scale that had never paid more than the standard rate, and that her satisfaction came from children's healing, not from profit. Judge scheduled the full custody hearing for May 15th. In the weeks leading up to it, sat with and Sarah in Sarah's office, discussing strategy. They needed to show that was not just reformed. She was a better parent now than she had been before. They needed to show that Maya's progress was directly connected to her mother's love and desire to be involved. And they needed to show that resistance to supporting Maya's therapy was evidence of prioritizing control over care. But there was one piece missing, Maya's own voice. "We need her to testify," Sarah said. "Her preferences matter. In custody cases, children's wishes are considered, especially at her age." "She won't speak," said quietly. "She hasn't spoken in 2 years." "Then we find another way," Sarah replied. It was who suggested it during one of Maya's therapy sessions. She called in Sarah with the idea and joined the conversation via phone, her voice trembling with hope and fear. "What if," said carefully, "we let Maya speak in the language she knows, the language of gestures, of signals? What if we brought Buddy to the courtroom?" There was silence on the line. "Is that even legal?" asked. "It's highly unusual," Sarah admitted, "but I think I can argue for it. The court's primary interest is in the best interests of the child. If allowing an emotional support animal in the courtroom helps that child communicate her wishes in the proceeding that will determine her future custody, that's a compelling argument." "It's risky," continued. "Judge might see it as theatrical, but if we frame it correctly, if we have proper documentation and credentials, if we position it as necessary accommodation for a child with selective mutism, then we might just have a chance," Sarah finished. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah filed the motion. She included credentials, documentation of Maya's therapy, and a detailed explanation of why the gesture-based communication system Maya had developed with Buddy was legitimate and necessary testimony. The lawyer filed an objection. "This is an attempt to manipulate the court through emotional appeals and animal theatrics," his filing stated. "The child's preferences should be expressed through proper channels, therapists, evaluators, not through a dog." But Judge, showing a judicial wisdom that would later prove crucial, scheduled a hearing specifically on the motion. He wanted to understand what they were proposing. He wanted to hear from herself about whether this was genuine therapy or courtroom performance. And so, on a warm May morning, sat in the judge's chambers with his lawyer present, and she explained, calmly, professionally, without any theatrical flair, what had transpired between Maya and Buddy. By the end of the meeting, Judge had made his decision. "I'll allow it," he said, "but understand this. If it appears to be manipulative or performative, I will have the animal removed immediately, and I will note this attempt in my ruling. The child's testimony, however it's expressed, must be genuine." The hearing was set for May 15th. And everyone understood that everything, Maya's future, second chance at motherhood's custody, and the power of silence itself hung in the balance. The courtroom on May 15th was packed. Word had spread through the legal community about the unusual case, the silent girl, the therapy dog, the custody battle that hinged on nonverbal testimony. Reporters sat in the back, their cameras held ready. The judge's clerk looked nervous. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man named, sat with his arms crossed, exuding skepticism. Judge entered with a grave expression. At 64, he'd presided over hundreds of custody cases. He believed in the law, in procedure, in evidence. But he was also a father of two, and he understood that sometimes the most important truths couldn't be reduced to legal documents. "This hearing is now in session," the clerk announced. State of Kentucky versus Custody Modification Petition regarding Maya Henderson. The first testimony took 3 hours. His lawyer presented his case methodically, had provided stability, consistency, and proper parenting. He'd enrolled Maya in school, maintained her medical appointments, kept her in familiar surroundings. The dog, he argued, was a distraction, a crutch that prevented genuine healing. Then's lawyer, Sarah, presented her evidence. She called 3 psychologists who had made genuine progress in her recovery. She called the hospital administrator who to work performance and reliability. She called who about Maya's improvements since beginning therapy with Buddy. Was called at midday. She sat calmly in the witness box, her silver hair catching the courtroom lights, her demeanor radiating quiet competence. Sarah walked her through her credentials, her 23 years of experience, her certifications, her published work on animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors. "Doctor," Sarah asked, "would you characterize Maya's progress as genuine therapeutic advancement?" "Absolutely," replied. "I've worked with hundreds of traumatized children. Maya's development of non-verbal communication skills with Buddy represents significant psychological progress. She's processing trauma, not avoiding it." His lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Doctor, isn't it true that Maya still hasn't spoken, that she remains unable to communicate with the broader world?" "Maya is communicating," replied calmly, "just not through words. The development of alternative communication systems is actually a sign of adaptive functioning, not dysfunction." "But she could speak if she chose to." "Potentially," acknowledged, "but forcing that would be, we should meet her where she is." By noon, both sides had presented their cases. Now came the moment everyone was waiting for, Maya's testimony. The bailiff escorted her into the courtroom. She was small for her age, her hair tied back with a simple blue ribbon. She wore a pale yellow dress that had chosen carefully, nothing that would look like costume or performance. She looked like what she was, a 9-year-old girl about to testify in a custody hearing that would determine where she'd live. Judge leaned down slightly. "Maya, do you understand that you're here to help me understand where you want to live?" Maya nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "And do you promise to tell the truth?" Another nod. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah stood. "Maya, I'm Sarah. I represent your mother. Do you know who your mother is?" Maya's eyes found in the courtroom. She nodded again. "Do you love your mother?" Maya's chin trembled slightly, but she made no sound. "Maya, can you tell me, can you tell us, what you feel when you think about your mother?" Nothing. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge's jaw tightened slightly. This was the problem they'd anticipated, Maya's inability to communicate verbally, even through the usual mechanisms of yes or no testimony. His lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is precisely why allowing this child in the witness box is inappropriate. She cannot communicate coherently. Any conclusions we draw from her testimony would be pure speculation." "Counsel," Judge said sharply, "let's allow this to proceed." Sarah approached the judge's bench and whispered something. He nodded and she turned back to Maya. "Sweetheart, I know it's hard to use words, but is there something else you could do, something you're more comfortable with. Sitting in the gallery with held her breath. This was the moment. This was everything. Maya looked down at her hands. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, her left hand rose from her lap. Her fingers began to move, a gesture and recognized immediately. A curved motion across her heart, 2 sharp taps on her collarbone, then her palm opened upward. The courtroom erupted in confusion. "Order," Judge commanded. "Silence in this courtroom." Lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, with all respect, the child is merely gesturing randomly. This proves the point that—" "Counsel, sit down," the judge interrupted. His eyes were fixed on. "Doctor, would you please explain what gesture we just witnessed?" Stood respectfully. "Your Honor, if I may approach the stand." Judge nodded and walked to stand near Maya. "Your Honor, this is the gesture sequence that Maya and I, with Buddy, have been developing over 6 months. It's part of her therapeutic communication system. The gesture she just made means—" Voice wavered slightly and she paused to compose herself. "It means I love you, I belong with you, you are my home." "And is this gesture something Maya makes frequently?" the judge asked. "She makes this specific sequence," replied, "only for people she loves and trusts completely. In my observation, she's made it approximately 40 times over 6 months, and always in private with Buddy or with, never for show." The courtroom was utterly silent. Sarah continued her questioning. "Maya, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Any other gestures?" For the next 15 minutes, Maya moved through her vocabulary of signs. She made the gesture for fear when asked about her father, hands pressed to temples, fingers splayed. She made the gesture for love and safety when asked about her mother and grandmother, the curved heart motion repeated twice. When asked her to show what Buddy meant to her, she made an elaborate sequence, both hands to her heart, then reaching outward, then a gentle pressing motion downward. A gesture explained meant grounding, safety, everything I need. Lawyer attempted to cross-examine her, but his questions were futile. He couldn't understand her language. No one could except and. He tried to get her to speak, to communicate normally. But Maya simply sat silently, her eyes sad but her expressions clear. When he finally sat down in frustration, even Judge shook his head slightly. "Ms., he said to Sarah, "I assume you're planning to have Doctor interpret these gestures for the record." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "All of these gestures are documented in Doctor's case files, with video recordings showing consistency over months." Stepped forward with a leather journal, showing the judge detailed notes, sketches, and even photographs illustrating each gesture. As she explained the system, Judge's expression shifted from skepticism to deep understanding. Then came the moment that would echo through the courtroom forever. As was explaining the final gesture, Buddy, who had been lying peacefully on the gallery floor beside, suddenly stood. Without any command, without any signal, he walked directly to the center of the courtroom. He approached the witness box where Maya sat, and he placed his head gently against her leg. Everyone saw it. The reporters stopped writing. Lawyer froze mid-objection. Judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The dog had understood. Buddy had recognized the power of what Maya was communicating, and he'd moved to stand beside her in her testimony. His voice was thick with emotion. "Your Honor, Buddy was abused so severely that he rarely initiates physical contact with anyone except Maya. That he approached her now in this moment shows." She stopped, unable to continue, tears streaming down her face. Judge stared at the girl, the dog, and the tableau they created together. Finally, he spoke. "I think I've heard all the testimony I need." The courtroom sat in stunned silence, everyone understanding that something profound had just occurred, something that transcended legal procedure, that spoke to truth in a way words never could. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. It was nearly 3 p.m., and the courtroom seemed to exist in a suspended moment. everyone aware that something profound was about to happen, yet unable to predict what form it would take. Judge sat quietly for a long moment after Maya's testimony, his hands steepled beneath his chin. The bailiff stood uncertainly by the door. Sarah and his lawyer sat in their respective positions, both seeming to sense that the traditional framework of legal procedure had somehow shifted beneath their feet. Then slowly, the judge began to speak. "I have presided over this case for 2.5 years," he said, his voice measured and contemplative. "I have reviewed psychological evaluations, medical records, therapy notes, and school performance reports. I have heard testimony from experts, from family members, and from the parties involved. But I believe what I just witnessed is the most honest testimony I've received." He paused, looking directly at Maya in the witness box. "However," he continued, "before I render my decision, I'd like to ask the child one final question, and I want to make clear that no one should coach or prompt this answer. Maya, this question is for you alone." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge leaned slightly forward. "Maya, where is your heart telling you that you belong?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Maya sat motionless in the oversized witness chair, her small hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were distant, as if she was looking beyond the courtroom walls, beyond the immediate present, into some place deeper and more true. Then slowly and with absolute deliberation, her head turned. Her eyes found her mother in the gallery. And everything changed. Maya's right hand rose from her lap with the precision of a conductor raising a baton. Her movement was slow, intentional, theatrical in its gravity but not in its intent. She extended her arm toward her mother, and her fingers began to move through the sequence that had explained only moments before. The curved motion across her heart, the 2 sharp taps on her collarbone, the final opening of her palm facing upward. It was the gesture of love, of belonging, of home. Henderson gasped. Tears streamed down her face, tears of recognition, of hope, of a mother finally hearing her daughter speak in a language she could understand. She rose from her seat, her hands pressed to her mouth, her entire body trembling. But what happened next stopped everyone's hearts. Buddy, who had been lying quietly beside Maya's empty seat in the gallery, suddenly stood. His golden head lifted, his ears perked. For a moment, he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear, a call beyond words, beyond sound, a frequency of love and belonging that animals apparently understood with perfect clarity. Then he moved. Not tentatively, not slowly. With absolute purpose and conviction, the large dog walked directly across the courtroom. He moved past the attorney's tables, past the bailiff. He walked with the certainty of someone or something that knows exactly where it belongs. He walked to his side. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. His lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is—" "Sit down," Judge said quietly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. His eyes never left the tableau of the girl, the dog, and the mother they had chosen. Buddy stood beside, his large golden frame creating a physical barrier between the mother and everyone else. His head was held high, his bearing regal, his presence an unmistakable statement. He pressed his side firmly against his leg and reached down with shaking hands to place her palm on his head. Stood, her face streaming with tears. "Your Honor, Buddy was never trained to do that. He has never approached anyone uninstructed. That dog just—" She couldn't finish her sentence through her tears. Rose beside her, gripping his hand. In the gallery, reporters photographed frantically, but Judge didn't order them to stop. He seemed to understand that this moment, this inexplicable, beautiful moment, needed to be witnessed and remembered. Sarah stood, her professional demeanor cracking with emotion. "Your Honor, I believe we've heard all the testimony we need." His lawyer attempted one final objection. "Your Honor, this is purely emotional manipulation. The dog's behavior proves nothing legally relevant." "Counsel," Judge interrupted, his voice sharp and final, I have made my decision. We will break for 30 minutes. I will return with my ruling." As the bailiff called for a recess, the courtroom seemed to fragment into 1,000 different conversations. But the central image remained frozen. Maya in the witness box, her hand still extended toward her mother. In the gallery, her trembling hand on Buddy's head. And Buddy, standing like a golden sentinel, bearing witness to what his heart had recognized, approached the bench and spoke quietly to Judge, who listened intently, his expression grave and contemplative. She was explaining something, the bond between Maya and Buddy, the significance of his movement, the language of unconditional love that transcended species and circumstance. Made her way to and embraced her, both women weeping openly. "He heard her," whispered. "That dog heard her heart calling, and he answered." In the witness box, the bailiff gently asked Maya if she wanted to step down. Maya shook her head. She remained seated, her eyes fixed on her mother across the courtroom, her hand still extended toward the woman who had loved her from the moment she was born, through the horror of that terrible day, and through the long silence that followed. Buddy, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained absolutely still beside. His tail didn't wag. His body didn't relax. He maintained his position with solemn dedication, as if understanding that this was his most important assignment, to stand beside the woman his girl loved most, to bear witness to the truth of that love. As the 30-minute recess ticked away, reporters huddled with lawyers. Sat slumped in his chair, seeming to understand that the case had turned against him in a way that no legal argument could counter. His lawyer whispered to him but wasn't listening. His eyes were on his daughter, on the girl who was no longer his, who had chosen, in the most eloquent silence imaginable, to go home to her mother. When Judge returned to the bench, everyone immediately rose. The judge looked tired but resolute. He looked at Maya, still seated in the witness box. He looked at her hand still on Buddy's head. He looked at Buddy, the unlikely hero of this entire proceeding, who had proven that love speaks a language older and more powerful than any legal statute. Then he picked up his pen, drew a deep breath, and began to write his ruling. In that moment everyone understood. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The silence had spoken. The gestures had, the dog had borne witness. Justice was about to be served, not through legal procedure but through the unmistakable voice of the human heart. Judge sat in his chambers during the 30-minute recess, staring at the blank legal pad before him. He'd been a judge for 32 years. He'd presided over 247 custody cases. He'd relied on evidence, testimony, documentation, and the letter of the law to guide every decision. But nothing in his judicial experience had prepared him for what had just occurred. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The girl's hand extending across the courtroom toward her mother. The dog's inexplicable movement. The absolute clarity of intent in both gestures. These were not words, yet they communicated more truth than hours of testimony could have conveyed. His clerk knocked and entered with coffee. Judge barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, moving through the philosophical implications of what he'd witnessed. He thought of his own daughter, now 35, a lawyer herself. He thought of a time when she was 8 years old and had refused to speak to him for an entire week after he'd missed her school play. She hadn't used words to express her hurt. She'd used silence, averted eyes, a deliberate distance. Yet he'd understood every word she wasn't saying. Her silence had been a voice louder than shouting. He thought about how communication had evolved throughout human history. Not all languages were verbal. Indigenous peoples had used fire and smoke. Sailors had used flags. Lovers had communicated through glances across crowded rooms. The deaf community had developed entire linguistic systems through gesture and sign. Who was he, as a judge bound by legal procedure, to declare that only words counted as valid testimony? Judge picked up his pen and began writing. Not his ruling yet, but his thoughts, his reasoning, the philosophical foundation that would support the decision his heart had already made. He wrote, "Testimony is the communication of truth. Truth transcends form. A child's hand extended toward her mother carries the weight of absolute honesty. A dog's inexplicable movement toward the woman his companion loves communicates something that no expert witness could articulate. These acts of testimony are valid. These acts are sacred." By the time the 30 minutes had elapsed, Judge knew exactly what he needed to do. He returned to the bench with a gravity that seemed to settle over the entire courtroom like a physical presence. The bailiff called everyone to stand. The judge surveyed the room, the reporters, the lawyers, the family members, the grandmother, the woman who'd taught him something today that law school never could. "This court has concluded the hearing regarding the custody modification petition for Maya Henderson," Judge began, his voice steady and clear. "Before I render my decision, I want to address something that has troubled me throughout my career." He paused, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes, a gesture he'd made hundreds of times before, but never with such weight behind it. "For 3 decades, I have presided over family law cases. I have made determinations that affected the lives of thousands of children, and I have always relied on one fundamental assumption, that the truth can be adequately expressed through words, through testimony, through documents, through the formal mechanisms of legal procedure." He looked directly at Maya. "Today, I learned that assumption was incomplete, perhaps even wrong." His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Judge raised his hand slightly, silencing any objection before it could form. "The child in this case has communicated her truth to me today through a language I initially did not recognize. Her truth came not through words, but through gesture, through signal, through the deliberate movement of her body and the clear expression of her heart. And in doing so, she has more honestly and powerfully than any adult in this courtroom." He replaced his glasses and looked toward, who sat with tears streaming down her face. "Doctor," he said, "would you approach the bench, please?" Rose and approached, her movements respectful and certain. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, is the communication system you've developed with Maya a valid language?" "Yes, Your Honor," replied without hesitation. "It is as valid as any verbal language, perhaps more valid in Maya's case, because it emerges from her truth rather than from imposed social convention." "And the dog's movement toward Ms. Henderson, in your professional observation, what does that communicate?" His voice trembled. "Recognition, Your Honor, recognition and love." Buddy responded to something authentic in Maya's gesture. He understood what her heart was saying and he moved to honor it. Judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Doctor." As returned to her seat, the judge turned his attention to the full courtroom. "I have spent 32 years believing that justice is about following procedures, applying statutes, and weighing evidence according to established legal standards. And those things matter. They matter deeply. They are the scaffolding upon which our legal system is built." He paused, his eyes moving across the faces in the courtroom. "But today, I have learned something that I should have known long ago, that justice is ultimately about truth, and truth speaks in many languages. It speaks in the words of experts. It speaks in the silence of a child who has learned that her voice was not safe. It speaks in the gesture of a hand extended toward home. It speaks in the inexplicable movement of a dog who recognizes what love looks like." He turned to address the full courtroom, his voice growing stronger. "I have learned today that voices come in many forms. Some voices use words. Some voices use gestures. Some voices use the simple act of showing up, of being present, of standing beside someone when they need you most. That dog in your gallery, that dog has a voice, and it spoke more clearly in this courtroom than any testimony I've heard in years." Reached over and squeezed his hand. Both women were crying openly now. "The question before me," Judge continued, "is not complicated. It never really was. The question is simply, where does this child's heart tell her she belongs? And that question has been answered, not with words, but with a clarity that transcends words. He looked at, the mother has demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. She has completed all required programs. She has maintained steady employment and housing. She has proven her commitment to her daughter's therapeutic needs. Most importantly, she has waited. She has waited through long months of separation, knowing that her daughter was healing with another, and she waited anyway, because she loves her daughter more than she loves herself. Then he turned to. The father has provided stability, but he has resisted supporting the child's therapeutic needs. He has placed his preferences above her healing. In custody matters, the child's welfare must always supersede parental preference. Judge returned his attention to Maya, still seated in the witness box. And this child has spoken to me today in a language older than words, more honest than any verbal testimony. She has told me where she belongs, and it is my duty as an officer of this court to listen. He picked up his written ruling. I am therefore granting full custody to Henderson, effective immediately. The father will maintain supervised visitation rights, which may be expanded pending successful completion of court-ordered family therapy. The child will continue her therapeutic relationship with Buddy, the dog she loves. This therapy will be considered a necessary medical expense, to be shared equally by both parents. He paused, looking up from his papers. But I want to end with this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I came to this bench today expecting to evaluate facts and apply law. Instead, I was taught a profound lesson about the nature of communication, about the language of the heart, and about how truth speaks when we're quiet enough to listen. He looked directly at. Thank you for reminding me that justice isn't about procedure. It's about justice. Thank you for teaching this old judge that the most powerful testimony often comes from silence. He turned back to the courtroom, his eyes glistening. This hearing is concluded. Court is adjourned. As the gavel came down, the courtroom erupted, but this time not in objection or legal argument, but in something deeper. Gasps of recognition, tears of relief, the understanding that something sacred had just transpired, something that transcended law and entered into the realm of truth itself. Maya rose from the witness box and walked directly toward her mother, rushed to meet her halfway across the courtroom. And as they embraced, Buddy moved to stand beside them, his golden frame completing a circle of love that had finally come home. The first 2 weeks after the hearing were a blur of logistics and emotions. Arranged to take 2 weeks off work. The court ordered to remove Maya's belongings from his house. Social services conducted a final home visit to approve apartment for custody. Throughout it all, insisted that Maya continue her regular visits to the sanctuary, that the sudden disruption of her therapeutic relationship with Buddy, even for a positive reason, could be. Transitions matter, explained to over coffee at the sanctuary. Even good transitions. Maya needs consistency while her world is changing. So they established a new routine. Maya would live with, but 3 afternoons a week she would come to the sanctuary to spend time with Buddy and found herself grateful for this structure. It gave her time to prepare meals, to make the apartment feel like home, to create the physical and emotional space where her daughter could heal in safety. The first night Maya slept in her new bedroom, a room had carefully decorated with soft colors and familiar items from her old life, heard sounds she hadn't heard in 2.5 years. Crying. Not silent tears, but actual sobs muffled by the pillow. Went to her daughter and lay down beside her on the bed. She didn't speak. She simply held Maya, feeling her small body shake with the release of emotions that had been locked inside for so long. They lay there together in the darkness, mother and daughter, connected by touch and presence and the simple fact of being together at last. By the end of the first week, something had begun to shift in Maya. She was more animated. She smiled more frequently. She initiated contact, reaching for his hand, leaning against her while they watched television, seeking her presence in ways she hadn't for years. But she still hadn't spoken. Never pushed. She'd learned patience. She'd learned that healing unfolds in its own time. She simply loved her daughter and waited. It was who first noticed the change in Maya's demeanor during the third week. "She's different," said Tu, who was observing one of their therapy sessions. "She's lighter somehow, like she's released something she was carrying." "She's home," replied simply. "She's finally home." That afternoon, Maya made a new gesture, one had never seen before. She pressed both her hands to her chest and then slowly spread her fingers open, as if releasing something precious into the world. Interpreted it as Maya saying, "My heart is opening. I'm letting things out." The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in early June. Maya and Buddy were at the sanctuary together. It was unusual, rarely came to the sessions, but had invited her to observe how Maya's therapy had evolved. They were sitting in the shelter beneath the oak tree, the same place where Maya and Buddy had developed their entire gestural language. Was telling a story, something she often did during their sessions, a story about a girl who learned to speak in many languages, who discovered that her silence had made her stronger, not weaker. She was describing how the girl's voice eventually returned, but different, deeper, more conscious, more precious because of the time it had been absent. As spoke, Maya made a gesture, the opening heart gesture, and then she did something unprecedented. She opened her mouth. Her lips moved, her throat contracted. A sound emerged, not words yet, but a sound. A tiny, barely audible sound that might have been a whimper or might have been a word struggling to be born. Gasped. Leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Maya," she said gently, "was that your voice?" Maya's eyes welled with tears. She opened her mouth again, and this time the sound was slightly louder, still not quite a word, but closer. It was the sound of someone relearning an instrument they hadn't played in years. "It's okay," said softly. "Take your time, your voice will come back when it's ready." They sat together in silence for several minutes. Buddy rested his head on Maya's lap, as if lending her his strength, and held hands, both of them barely breathing. Then Maya tried again. A sound emerged, wavering, uncertain, but unmistakably attempting to form a word. It sounded like ma. Covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Mama," prompted gently. Maya tried again. "Mama," she said, her voice barely a whisper, rusty from disuse but absolutely clear. "Mama." The word hung in the air like something sacred, like the first word ever spoken in human history. "Yes, baby," whispered, crawling across the ground to embrace her daughter. "Yes, I'm here, I'm right here." Maya pressed her face against her mother's chest, and for the first time in 21 months she spoke. The words came haltingly at first, fragmented and uncertain. I'm home." Her mother wept, 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 and Buddy, sensing the magnitude of the moment, placed his paw gently on Maya's back, as if bearing witness to the miracle of her voice returning. Over the following weeks, Maya's voice gradually returned to fuller function. The words came back slowly at first, simple words, necessary words, words that had been locked away for so long they needed to be relearned. But with each passing day, she spoke more. She told her mother about her dreams. She shared stories about school. She laughed, a sound so beautiful that would sometimes just stop what she was doing to listen. By midsummer, 1 year after the custody hearing, invited everyone, Judge, Sarah, and even some of the reporters who'd covered the case, to a special gathering at the sanctuary. Judge arrived in his judicial robes, having come directly from the courthouse. He was greeted with warm recognition. "I wanted you to meet someone," said, leading him to the shelter beneath the oak tree. Maya stood beside Buddy, her small hand resting on his head. She was smiling, a real smile, bright and genuine. She was completely present, completely herself. "Your Honor," said, "I'd like you to meet Maya, the real Maya, not the silent girl from the courtroom, but the whole person she's becoming." Judge knelt slightly to meet Maya at eye level. "Hello, Maya, I remember you. You taught me something very important." "I know," Maya said, her voice still small but gaining strength every day. "I taught you about voices." The judge was visibly moved. "You did indeed." "I have a voice now," Maya continued. "My real voice. But I also have the voice I learned with Buddy. Says I can use both, that both are part of who I am." Judge looked at who nodded. "Maya's learning that trauma doesn't erase who you are. It changes you, but it also teaches you. She can speak words now, but the gesture language, the language she developed to survive, that's part of her too, and she's honoring both." As the afternoon progressed, everyone gathered to celebrate, brought refreshments, watched her daughter interact with the gathered adults, no longer afraid, no longer silent, but still carrying the grace and wisdom that her silence had taught her. At one point, Judge pulled aside. "You should know," he said, "that this case has changed how I approach family law. I've been consulting with other judges about accommodating nonverbal communication in courtroom proceedings. Maya's testimony taught me that justice isn't about forcing people into conventional forms. It's about finding truth wherever it lives." Smiled. "I think that's exactly what Buddy knew all along." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the sanctuary, Maya stood between her mother and Buddy, her small hand holding her mother's while her other rested on the dog's head. She was exactly where she belonged, in a place where silence was understood, where different languages of love were honored, where a broken girl and a damaged dog had taught everyone present that healing is possible, that love speaks louder than violence, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that learn to speak in their own unique way. Watched her granddaughter and thought about that terrible day almost 3 years ago. The violence, the silence, the long darkness that had seemed endless. But standing here now, watching Maya smile at her mother, watching Buddy's tail wag with the joy of a dog who knew he'd found his purpose, understood that sometimes healing isn't about returning to what was before. It's about becoming something new, something stronger, something that carries both the scars and the wisdom of survival. And in that becoming, Maya had found not just her voice, but her whole self. The parts that spoke with words and the parts that spoke with gesture, the parts that were wounded and the parts that were healing. She had finally come home,